Welcome to this Cold War past paper question. This time we're writing a narrative analysing the events of the Berlin crisis of 1947 to 49. So whenever we do a narrative, we have to consider the overarching story. What happens in the story? And we normally have to break this down into three parts. Paragraph 1 would normally be the beginning or the causes. Paragraph 2 would be the middle of the story, so maybe the event in question or maybe some other thing. And then paragraph 3 will be the end, the consequences normally. So you're splitting your essay into three parts, a beginning, a middle and an end. So we need to be very careful, first of all, when looking at the question. We're being asked about the Berlin crisis of 47 to 49. So we need to be careful because the other Berlin crisis was 1958 to 61, and that involved Khrushchev and Eisenhower and Kennedy. This one, however, is exclusively between Truman and Stalin. So just making sure that you're aware that the Berlin crisis involves the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. So let's have a think about what we can actually put into an answer for this narrative. So what can we include in this particular narrative? Well, I'm just going to spend a few minutes going through the slide, and maybe this will act as a bit of revision for you, and hopefully it'll refresh your memory about what happens in the events. But please do go to your notes and any other resources you have in order to get the detail. But really, we need to start and think by 1947, which is the start of the question, we know that Germany and Berlin themselves had been divided after Yalta and then Potsdam. So by 1947, they were divided. And we know that the Allied Control Council, the ACC, had been really unable to work together because I think they had to have a unanimous vote on any decisions, and of course the Soviets and the Americans had very different views on how Germany should be run, so they weren't getting along. And this resulted in 1948 in January that the three zones, the Western zones, that's the UK, France and the USA, decided to create one huge zone which they named Trizonia. Of course, this also led to, in June 1948, them developing a new currency to unify the economies of that area. And they called that the Deutschmark. And this was an especially quite strong currency, much stronger than the Reichsmark that was being used in the Eastern zone that the Soviets were occupying. And so, of course, this drove Stalin to become very furious. He hadn't been consulted. The currency in West Berlin was much stronger. As well as that, it made the East look bad because the West was also receiving Marshall aid as well at this time. So the West was developing really well, and the East was looking like it was derelict and nothing was being improved. So of course it looked like communism was failing in the East. So Stalin's furious. He feels like the other three zones were ganging up on him, and of course he decides, I need to take action. So what does he do? In June 1948, he decides to blockade West Berlin. He cuts off all the electricity, all access by road, rail and canal. And as you know, this was in an attempt to starve the Allies out. They was hoping to put pressure on the West to leave Berlin for good, hopefully trying to occupy it. Now, we also know that the US will not accept this. They've got a policy of containment since the Truman Doctrine came out, and they also don't want to step down to this challenge. This is really the first big challenge between Stalin and Truman. There's been tension, but this is the first real challenge. And so, in order to stand up to Stalin, but also find a peaceful way of dealing with it, the Allies decided to do airlift, food, coal and supplies into the West. 2/3 of everything they sent in was coal. We know it lasted about 10 months, didn't it? With 275,000 flights and millions of tons of goods being taken over the time. There was thousands per day being sent out. Flights leaving every 30 to 90 seconds on a rolling basis. So they had this huge effort. And then, of course, by May 1949, Stalin realizes that it's not working, and so he backs down and lifts the blockade, and this leads to many consequences. Firstly, the effect on relations. Of course, Stalin looked really aggressive, and he looked weak for backing down, whereas the US, this was a propaganda victory for them because it was quite clear that they'd found a peaceful method to an aggressive problem. Even though they had the nuke, they chose to find peaceful ways. We know that then the West, feeling the threat of Stalin and hoping to deter him from any further aggression, created NATO, where they all would work together, and if one of them was attacked, they could all help each other out. And of course, Germany was then permanently divided into East and West Germany. The west of Germany was known as the Federal Republic of Germany, with the capital city at Bonn. And the East then, Stalin's reaction to that then was to create the German Democratic Republic, which would be centered around East Berlin. So these are all of the events that took place. The only trouble now is trying to decide, well, where do we start and where do we end? What goes into each paragraph? So what I always try and get students to do is to try and remember that you've got to try and have a beginning, a middle and an end. Well, how can we do that? Well, let's have a think. Some of these events are causes, some of them talk about the events themselves, and some of them are the end of the story. So what I've done is I've suggested perhaps this as a bit of a split. I thought, well, if you look at these events here are all about what causes the Berlin blockade and leads up to Stalin now making a decision. These events are the event themselves, where we've got the blockade and what Stalin has done. And then these events all deal with the sort of consequences of that, which is that the Allies then have to fly in the food. So there's sort of a beginning of what caused it. We've got a middle section, which is the event itself. And then you've got the sort of airlift that happens afterwards. I think that's a pretty good split. You could argue that you could do the causes as paragraph 1. You could then put the blockade and the airlift as sort of one big paragraph full of lots of sort of events details, and then you could have the consequences as the final paragraph, and you could talk about NATO, and because they happened in 1949, so they're in the date range. Yeah, but I mean, it's up to you how you split them. I've suggested we go with paragraph 1 beginning, the middle of the story, and the end being the sort of airlift and consequences of that. So that's up to you how you want to split it, but that seems a very logical way to carve out a beginning, middle and end. Now remember, when you write this, the key skill here is being able to link between paragraph 1 to paragraph 2, then 2 to 3. How do the three events themselves, or the three chunks that we've chosen, how do they link between each other? What's the best way to do that? I'm going to ask you guys now to pause the video, have a go at writing your question. It's going to take you about sort of 10, 12, maybe even 13, 14 minutes. But I'll leave this on the screen. Write your paragraph now, and then what we can do is I'll put an exemplar on when you unpause it, and you can see how I've done paragraph 1, and you can compare it to yours. Well, good luck. Okay, so let's have a look at paragraph 1. I've written the causes paragraph, and just have a look at the different words that I've used to link within the paragraph itself, and especially how I've linked at the end of the paragraph, which links on to the next paragraph, paragraph 2. So let's have a look. So I've boldened the words that I think are good linking words within the paragraph. Since Potsdam, Germany and Berlin had been divided into 4 zones. However, by 1947, the Allied Control Council failed to get the Western zones and the Soviet zone to work successfully together. Therefore, for unity, the UK, France and US joined their zones to form Trizonia. So we've got that next step. So then they formed their zones in 47. Not only this, they then set about creating a single currency, the Deutschmark, to control their economies jointly. However, as Stalin had not been notified of this, he felt left out, and it made him believe the Western powers were ganging up on him. So we've now got Stalin's reaction. It also then became clear that with martial aid flowing into the West Berlin, Easterners were able to see that the capitalist side was improving while East Berlin was in steady decline. You can also even mention here that the Deutschmark threatened to bankrupt East Berlin because their currency was much weaker and people were going across and trading their money in. Anyway, in any case, we can say in order to remedy this, Stalin became determined to push the West out of Berlin and take the city for himself. And here's the link to the next paragraph, and that a blockade might be the answer. So then that links us now onto the blockade paragraph. Nicely, that sort of little teaser at the end of the paragraph links us to the next paragraph. So I hope that's been useful in at least planning out your question. Obviously, you would have done paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. In that sort of vein, if it's very similar to how I've done it, then that's great. If you need to add more linking words in, do that and try and think, how can I link each event to the next? How can I tell a story? But hopefully that will help, and good luck with your essay writing.